Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for another installment of our research webinar series hosted by our team here at MVLRI, or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of the Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Just a quick disclaimer before we begin today. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during the webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. I'll take a moment now to introduce today's presenters. First, we have with us Michael Golden, CEO and founding partner of Educurious. Michael is a proven leader committed to education reform. Prior to starting Educurious, he was the corporate vice president of Education Products Group at Microsoft. Michael has an EDD in Education Leadership from the University of Pennsylvania, an MBA from Harvard University, and a BA from Williams College. We also have with us today Jane Chadsey, VP of School Solutions. Jane has designed Educurious's professional learning network using a blended learning model of face-to-face and virtual experiences that support Educurious services and solutions. Before that, she was the Director of Curriculum and Instruction at Renton School District. Jane has an MA in Curriculum and Instruction from Seattle Pacific University and a BA from the University of Washington. Lastly, we also have with us Adam Goldfarb, Strategy and Analytics Lead. Adam develops the Educurious website, manages social media, supports curriculum implementation, and analyzes organizational data. Before joining Educurious, Adam worked at RMC Research on projects with the NYC DOE and NYSED. Adam has a BA with high honors from Dartmouth College, majoring in math and social sciences and English. With that, I'll hand it over to our presenters.
Well, thanks very much, Justin. We appreciate the welcome and the opportunity to present our work to this group. There's a lot of room to learn more about this field of blended learning, and in particular, our approach is project-based blended learning, so a really niche sort of environment. So can I do the slides here, Justin, or do you need me to, or do you do that? I guess I can. Okay, great. So a little bit
Go ahead.
about us as an organization. We're a 501c3 nonprofit located in Seattle. Our initial funding came from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we were funded in their Next Generation Learning portfolio. So 4 years ago, we set upon a path to develop an approach to 21st century learning, to re-engage students in school. And not just the students, but their teachers as well, and bring that enthusiasm and creativity back into schools. And so our approach is, as I said, is excuse me, blended and problem and project-based learning. Our initial focus was on high school, and most of the research that has been done to date has been in high school settings. So let's see. So that tells you a little bit about us. I'm going to go into this slide and tell you about our approach. So the idea here is that we want to spend some time telling you about our approach and then tell you about some of the studies that have already been completed and then what our research questions are now. So again, I appreciate you being here and look forward to hearing your comments in the chat. So first of all, we have focused on two subject areas. Biology and English language arts. So I see a few of you are from Canada. So from a US perspective, our focus is building content that is built to our new standards, the Common Core State Standards and Next Generation Science Standards. And so we worked with a subset of the College of Education at the University of Washington called the Life Center. So the Life Center is, the acronym is Learning in Formal and Informal Environments. And with a group of learning scientists at the University of Washington, we established a set of 10 learning design principles. And so we built units in biology and English language arts based on those 10 design principles, which we'll share with you. And the reason we focused in on those two subject areas is for the US, those are two subject areas that are both gatekeepers and gateways for kids. So the third one, of course, is algebra. We felt that a lot of people are working on that. Looking back on that decision now, we wish we would also have content in math because we certainly get a lot of requests for that. So these are problem-based learning units built from a question that asks a real problem in the world. We'll talk a little bit about that later. It's all digital content. We've initially built the content in Instructure Canvas as the platform, but we can migrate to pretty much any learning management system that allows us to use those 10 design principles. And the second circle there to the right is about our professional development approach. So the teachers that we work with, generally speaking, come to us in a cohort. They start in the summer with a 3 to 5 day, depending on where and how we do this, face-to-face gathering. And at this face-to-face in the summer, we work on the learning design principles, and then we dive deeply into the units that we've constructed. So either biology or English language arts. We're beginning to see social studies teachers in those English language arts units that were originally constructed, but they're so cross-disciplinary that we have teachers from other subjects joining in. So we talk about the learning design principles, we do a deep dive into 1 or 2 units, and then every 2 weeks, we follow up with our teachers online. So our biology teachers meet in a facilitated synchronous event every 2 weeks, and our humanities teachers meet in a different synchronous event every 2 weeks. And we talk about instructional strategies, we look at student work. So we do everything you do in a local community, but these are teachers from around the country that are working with us in this cohort design. And then we also construct a news feed each week that has instructional strategies for the week ahead. So if we know that peer reviews are coming up or students are posting things on discussion boards with responses, or it's time for some formative assessment, what we do is we write about those instructional strategies in a document we call Hot Topics, and that goes into teachers' mailboxes every Friday so that they can prepare for instruction in the following week. We also do some virtual coaching and so on. But the design of our professional learning is situated in what we would call a blended professional learning approach, or professional development approach. We use the research on primarily the National Science Foundation grants and local systemic science initiatives that say that there's a tipping point of the number of hours that takes for teachers to shift their practice, and that we don't really begin to see those big shifts until about 45 hours of professional development. So if you count up the hours in the face-to-face and the every 2 weeks and the individual coaching that we do virtually, that ends up being somewhere between 45 and 50 hours within a school year. So we think that that design is really important to creating the shifts to blended and project-based learning that we hope to see. And then to the right and on the bottom, we think about technology as a space for creativity and collaboration. And so what we mean by that is when we look at the design, our design principles, you'll see that social networking is one of our design principles, that using disciplinary tools related to technology is an important part of the work we do with schools and teachers. For example, podcasts, film, graphic novels are all projects that we work with, have embedded in our content and our instructional approach. When students write a screenplay, they use screenwriting software or graphic novel software. And so our goal is to use the disciplinary tools that are used in the workforce today in the projects that students complete. And then the fourth component of our work is what we call the Educurious Expert Network. And so this is a database of volunteers who work in the fields that the students are studying. So when students are learning how to write an evidence-based argument, our experts are op-ed writers and lawyers and journalists, or if they're in a unit about the spread of infectious disease, they're infectious disease doctors and scientists and so on. So the experts work in schools in 4 ways. First of all, we've filmed some high-level experts, like Gary Ross, the director and screenwriter of the first Hunger Games movie. He talks to the students in a one-way video about how to take a book like Suzanne Collins' Hunger Games and turn that into a screenplay. He talks about his own experiences in high school. He talks about what to do when a writer gets stuck. So one-way videos is one way. The second way is that we Skype or use Google Hangouts our experts into classrooms as a virtual guest speaker, and then the students follow up with that expert on a discussion board. The third way is a really deep experience where an expert takes on supporting 4 to 6 students, actually reads their student work, provides track changes feedback, and then sends it back to the student, and all that happens on the discussion board. And the fourth way is that we teachers connect with our expert network database when they themselves are writing project-based blended learning units. And then when they need expertise to help them with content knowledge or with the construction of units. So again, the 4 components of our work are digital problem-based learning units constructed primarily in biology and English language arts, although we are constructing others at this moment. A very robust professional development design to shift practice, using technology to foster creativity and collaboration, and then the expert network. And we think that those 4 things together are what is really important in shifting what happens in schools to better prepare our students for their future. So that gives you the overview of what we do. This slide are our 10 learning design principles. So you can see that the first one there up at the top is to position students as developing experts. And then there's the project-based learning. I want to call out a couple of these. Number 5 is the expert network. And then number 7 is really intended to take on the issues of multicultural experiences and making sure that students are seen and that their cultures and communities are brought into schools. So it's connecting students in and out of school experience and also their prior interests and identities. And so that's one of our design principles. You can see the social networking, the use of digital tools and literacies, and this idea of multiple means of expression. So as I'm sure you well know, that in problem and project-based learning, an essential component is that the students share their work with an authentic audience. And so sometimes we do that digitally where things are posted on, for example, Teen Inc. and other websites, and sometimes it's done face-to-face. So again, ours is a blended learning model of project-based learning. So I want to point out to you also that, yes?
It looks like we have a question from Randy, who is wondering how you came about developing those design principles.
They come from learning sciences. So the primary work that they are based on is John Bransford's work, How People Learn. That is what's known about learning sciences now. And so so that's the process we used, is that it's his primary research, and then we'd be happy to send out to you, Justin, and you can send out to folks the list of research that these came from, but it's probably a list of 50 or so sources. Does that help, Randy? Okay. All right, let's go ahead and go on. So we'd also like to let you know that if you go to our website at educurious.org, and you go to the, there's a tab that says research there, a link that says research. And at that link, you'll find all 10 learning design principles on the right-hand side. So the 10 that are in that circle. And then to the left, you'll see the definition of the learning design principle, which you'll see in the circle there. So this was youth is positioned as developing experts. And then to the left are a series of questions that we work with teachers on to think about their own practice. So this is the first thing that we do in our face-to-face gathering in the summer, is really work on understanding these. And then as teachers work through the process of using our content, we're constantly coming back to these as they exist in the units. So we think about our work with teachers as a three-phased approach. The first that we call is adopt. And so what we mean by that is the adoption of these learning design principles as an instructional practice, adoption of the structure of blended project-based learning, adoption of, it could be of our instructional units that are exemplars of problem and project-based learning. So we call that adopt. The second phase we call adapt. And as you know, when you have digital content, it's easy to adapt the content to a local context. And so we quickly work with teachers on how to adapt our content to their local context so that it's more relevant to the students they serve. And then we think of the third phase is innovate. So adopt, adapt, innovate. And at the innovation phase, teachers are writing their own content. And by that point, these design principles are so deeply embedded in their work that they use the design principles to construct their own learning. So if you, again, want to go to our website and look at these more in depth, all 10 of them, go to educurious.org and then find the tab that says Our Work, and then there's a link to research. So these are to just give you a little bit of an overview of how we think about the questions. So right now we have 5 biology units that are interdisciplinary. And they, again, are also located on our website. And this is on the Solutions tab and then Project-Based Courses. These are 2 examples of questions. So the way we think about problem and project-based learning is that it starts with what we call a need to know. You may also know of these questions as essential questions or driving questions. We think about them as need to know because these are real problems that need to be solved in the world. So it distinguishes between project-based learning and problem-based learning. And then the project is intended to help resolve this big question. So for example, how do infectious diseases constantly outsmart us and continue to threaten human populations around the globe, and so on. So we always start with what we call a need to know question. And then the content, this is an example from environmental health, and some of the things that you'll see as constants in the curriculum. So the first one are the Educurious expert videos. And so these are the one-way videos I described earlier. In our biology courses, you'll always see some sort of research design question. It's a big instructional shift in our next generation science standards. And it's these research design questions that the experts review in that most intensive interaction that I described, where they review work and put it back on the discussion board. We also have what we are called literacy design collaborative prompts. And these are scaffolds and writing prompts that are included in our English language arts and humanities content, but also in biology. It's one of those things that's an unusual thing to have in a biology content, is a really clear focus on writing. And then because it is blended learning, we also include hands-on labs, and then the disciplinary tools and online simulations for the work students do online in the blend. So I'm going to pause for a second and just see if there are any questions so far. It's a lot of information. Give you a minute to think that through. Okay, so it looks like there are people typing. So Justin, I'll wait for you to translate. I can't see the questions there.
Looks like we have a question from Lori Ann, who's asking whether or not these projects are mainly high school projects.
Yes, so right now, the ones that are on our website are built to the 910 Common Core ELA standards here in the States. And the biology are built to the high school biology courses. Right now, we're working on a set of courses for 8th grade. And those include 6 units in social studies, in math, in English language arts, and in social studies. And so those will be ready for fall. And we also have a unit that we built for an 11th grade cross-disciplinary unit at a high school in Detroit. They had in their closets a whole bunch of Sherlock Holmes novels, and they asked us to create a unit that would be cross-disciplinary where they could use those books. So we had to rack our brains for a little while to think about how to make Sherlock Holmes relevant to high school kids in Detroit. But we ended up with a cross-disciplinary unit that includes chemistry, mathematics, social studies, and English language arts. So that also will be available in the fall.
Tell them what the challenge is.
Yeah, Michael's reminding me about the challenge. So it's a simulation of a NFL quarterback who actually is found dead after a party. And so the chemistry kids work on the forensics of what might have happened. And in the math classroom, they work on the mathematics that helps support the forensics. And then in the social studies classroom is a mock trial where the person who's charged with the crime goes to trial. And then in the language arts classroom, the students study crime novels as a genre study. So they're just getting started on that now. So one of the things I'll tell you about in a minute is that before we send out any of our content into the world, it's tested multiple times through an iterative research design process. And so it starts with a pilot, and the teachers at Pershing High School in Detroit are doing the pilot right now. We'll gather all the data about that, including engagement surveys of students and academic assessments around that. And then we redesign, and then we do it a second time before we are ready to send it out into the world. So thanks for that good question. So I just want to show you a couple of, did you have something, Justin?
Oh, yep. It looks like Lori had one other follow-up and wondering whether or not there are plans in the works to maybe develop down to the lower grades, the elementary grades.
Yeah, good question. The work we do at the elementary level right now is that on that phase of adopt, adapt, innovate, in the innovation space, we've been working with elementary teachers to write their own units. And so we do have a couple of elementary sites where that's happening, where we start with the learning design principles, and then we have a process of determining the real problem to solve in the world, aligning that problem to the standards that we're held accountable for. So what would we be doing to solve that problem, and how does that align? Then we connect the teachers with an expert in that field, and together the expert and the teacher construct a unit. So we have one elementary school here near Seattle right now that are testing out their units. And so the teachers are going through that same iterative design process that we do when we construct new content. Okay. All right, so I want to show you a few screenshots of the way the content is built out in a learning management system. So when the second way that the experts work with teachers, when we Skype them in or do Google Hangouts, then the expert comes into the classroom as a virtual guest, and then this is the kind of follow-up that happens. So students use the discussion board, enter at least 2 of your favorite questions about environmental toxins. Your teacher and the experts will look at the questions and help you respond to them through the unit, so that discussion board keeps going. So that's an example from a screenshot. So this is the way the content is built in so that students can self-pace or group pace through the content. We start out, our content is built in a unit that is about 6 weeks long, and those are the units that you'll find on our website, as I described earlier. And then each unit is broken down into a series of modules. And then the modules have agendas. So you'll see this one is a unit called Imagining New Worlds that focuses on dystopian literature. So there's a module A where they understand it, and then they explore archetypes, and then they do some reading and annotating, and then they do some crowdsourcing. So this is the social network piece of the design principle. So when students are working in the content, and they are working through the vocabulary and the comprehension strategies, then they use Post-it notes as the in-person version of annotating the text. But then they take those annotated text and they put them up on the discussion board and look at all the different possibilities that students are working through, and then they crowdsource those and keep those together with their own annotations, and then participate in a Socratic seminar. So that's kind of the blend that we have set up, so that it's, working in group, large group, working in small group, working online, using social networks to gain understanding, and the content is all built into there. The other thing that I wanted to point out on this screenshot are the studio days. So one of the things we've learned in our research and development phase is that if students are going to construct a graphic novel, then there's a high level of work that needs to happen there to make it really great. And so studio days are built in so that students learn the genre of graphic novels. And studio days are built in for understanding those. And studio days are built in for script writing and film. So those are also built into the content. And then, one of the great things that we're working on right now here in reading is this idea of reading closely to understand challenging text. And again, we use crowdsourcing as a way for students to read closely and share their comprehension of text. So that's the social networking. Kids also have to do a lot of project management. And so what you see here is the icon says what to do. And so each one of those links goes to all the resources that students need to be able to do the work. And then they submit it as an assignment, and then they move through the process of learning the content. And then the picture in the lower right is a Socratic seminar that's followed up as the in-class piece of that. And then another one of our design principles is this idea of competency-based pathways. So you can see that all the digital resources on the left, so that it might take me one of those digital resources to really get what's going on. It might take Michael 5. And so all of those are there. And then there are extension opportunities that students can work on if they want to go deeper. So trying to hit that right place of what everybody needs. So I'm going to pause here again and see if there are questions, and then go into some of the impact that we have seen, and then open it up for some discussion about what further research questions we have. Okay, doesn't look like anybody's typing now, so I'll go forward and talk about our impact. Okay. So one of the things that is built into each of our units are pre and post tests. And I want to describe a little bit of the process that we use to develop the units. So a team from the University of Washington, the Life Sciences, the Life Center with learning scientists and Educurious team members would build a unit. So for example, Imagining New Worlds that you just saw the screenshots from. And then we would go into a classroom and test it in the classroom with the designers in the classroom with the teacher every day, all day for 6 weeks. There are cameras rolling, pre and post test data, engagement surveys with kids, focus groups with kids and teachers, and then all that data comes back, and then it was analyzed, and then it was redesigned, and then we did that a second time. And then 2 years ago, we went out into very different contexts around the country. So from small rural school districts to the school district of Philadelphia. And in those settings, a group of teachers that we call partner teachers taught all 5 units of biology or all 5 units of English language arts. That's what we had at the time. And then we watched the data for that. So this data, the reading scores increase, was from what we called enactment sites. And those were one of those testing sites from the first time a unit was implemented or the second time. And so this is the pre and post test data from one classroom in an inner city school in Seattle. You can see for people from the US, these are Common Core standards down below, and then achievement bars. So there's the pre is the blue-green, and the post is the orange. So we saw really good increases from pre to post within a unit. So that's within 6 weeks. And then same data, kind of data set. This is the pre and post writing skills. This was a case study that the students wrote on an evidence-based argument, a controversy that they determined they cared about, that they chose, did the research. The pre-writing was a case study that was given to the kids. The final arguments were the controversies they chose to write about. And again, you can see the standards at the bottom and the scores. This was scored with a rubric that the researchers got together and calibrated all the scores, and then scored the writing. So these last two are examples of the data that we used in revision to revise our content. But it does give you a bit of an understanding of the gains that students have in that 6-week period. This slide tells you about the engagement surveys. So one of the things we wanted to know was whether or not we were actually increasing student engagement in schools. And so you'll see the weeks there to the right. And then as the web expands, there are higher levels of student engagement. And so these 5 dimensions of engagement come from gaming. So that's where we took the research base for this. So there are a set of 5 questions or 5 or 6, that in our research and evaluation phase that the students responded to every week. Now we do it about every 2 or 3 weeks, but we've kept this in the unit. So the first one, focused immersion, is, they're really paying attention and they're kind of lost in it. Heightened enjoyment is basically, are you having fun? Temporal dissociation is, am I losing track of time? Narrative engagement is about whether or not you tell other people about it. And intention to revisit is whether you'll come back to it. So I spent a lot of my career as a central office curriculum director, and we used to go on classroom walkthroughs all the time of schools. And there was always a box about student engagement. And we'd check that box about whether or not we thought the students were engaged or not. And then we'd come out in the hallway and say, how did you even know that? Or what were the indicators of that? So what I really appreciate about this is it gives a way to think about engagement, and it's student responses. So it's asking the students how they feel. So you can see that in week 2, there's a big burst of engagement. And you might guess that in week 2, what happened was, in this early enactment, the project wasn't introduced until the 2nd week. The first week was all about what are we going to do and what's going to happen and so on. And so you can see a big burst of engagement in the 2nd week when the project was introduced. And in week 5, that was an assessment week. And so anyway, you can really see those moments of engagement. And we now use these engagement surveys to work with teachers on as they work on either constructing units at the elementary level, or the students are working through units at the secondary level. And I see Sue is writing a question. So I want to also tell you about some other research that has been done on our work. The first one up at the top on the left, Proficiency-Based Pathways project. So one of the school districts that we've worked with for 3 years now is the School District of Philadelphia. And they had a project grant to construct their own content for English language arts. And they really struggled with that. It's much harder to write content than it looks at first glance. And so they contracted with us to provide our English language arts content, and then we provided all the professional development to support them. And so we were in 6 schools in the School District of Philadelphia. And this was the year 2 evaluation report. And we got really good data from this. There were fewer disciplinary actions in the schools. The students performed better on local benchmark assessments. Their grades improved each quarter. So their grades were higher than the control group in the first quarter of grading, but not as much as by the 4th quarter. So what we learned from that is continued engagement with the content and the professional development for the teachers, that it actually increased student learning over the course of a school year. And so I think there's probably some other data around that one, but that was in the School District of Philadelphia. We also contracted with HMRO to do an evaluation of our approach, and this will get to some research questions that we currently have. So in this case, it was 3 sites, and this was the year, as was the Proficiency-Based Pathways project, when we had teachers from around the country who were using our approach and set aside what they were doing, used all of our content for a full year of instruction, and participated in all the professional development. And we used the ACT Plan or Explore assessment as the pre-test to just make sure that the students that we were looking at based on and compared to the control group weren't already starting at a higher level. And then we gave the quality core assessments at the end of the year in either biology or English language arts. And what we wanted to know was, were students better prepared for college? And were there any differences in the achievement levels of the kids who weren't experiencing our approach compared to those who were? So the challenge of the study is, as you know, as researchers, there were so many conflicting variables. So number one is, how deeply did the teachers actually use the content? And was there a difference between teachers who fully engaged and teachers who partially engaged? So for example, there was one biology teacher that was fully engaged and the data was great in her classroom. In the classroom where there was less engagement of the teachers, there were fewer, we didn't see the same kinds of gains. So it's all of those sort of conflicting variables that make it tricky to study work like this. So one of our questions is the fidelity of the implementation. So one of our, as I said earlier, one of our theories is that teachers will go through a phase of adopt, adapt, and innovate. So if they adapt too quickly, does that take away from the power of the approach or not? So I think one question we have would be about that phased approach, and then what does that mean in terms of student achievement, so fidelity of implementation. You know, and the other thing that was really challenging about this HMRO study is by giving the quality core at the end of the year, at the same time students were taking their high stakes assessments, there was a lot of test fatigue. So we asked HMRO to go back and analyze the data from the state assessments at the same time just to see if there were differences. So that's what these next few slides show. So this is a high school in Cleveland, Ohio, and there they use the MAPS assessment, Measures of Academic Progress, as a pre-assessment, and they use, this is the state high stakes assessment at the end of the year. And this is the same this is New Steel was the school that we worked with. Madison, Jefferson, and Washington are feeder schools in the same area, so same demographics of kids. And so you can see that in the pre and post-test data, there were more kids in high proficiency and mid proficiency and fewer kids in low proficiency by the post-test. So, and this was a school where there was really high fidelity of implementation. And then this is an English classroom in Seattle Public Schools. The Educurious 2013-14 was the year that we did our full-scale study of a full implementation with all 5 units and so on. And so this was the teacher this is the same teacher at these 2 teachers, the non-Educurious and the Educurious, same school. The whole school is project-based learning, one-to-one. They're actually New Tech Network schools, so we wanted to take away the confounding variables of whether or not one teacher was using project-based learning or not. And then the state passing rate, and this is, again, is the high stakes assessment in English language arts. And so we're going to pause now. Gave you a ton of information, and I'm going to turn it over to Michael to see what kinds of research questions he'd like to sort of pose for us now and think about.
So any questions in the meantime before we move on?
Why don't you go ahead, Michael,
Okay.
and pose some questions?
Okay, so as Jane described, one of the things we tried to do throughout this process, the development process, is really think about 3 different levels of research. The first level of research is tied to using research and best practices as the research basis. And that's the source of the learning design principles and other aspects of our work. And what we thought when you saw those 4 circles is there is best proven practice on each of them, but what's unique about our work is combining the 4 in conjunction with those learning and research design principles. The second aspect of the research, as she described it, was this Agile Development, iterative, continuous assessment and redesign based on student and teacher feedback, engagement surveys, pre and post data, and all the other assessments throughout the unit. Then the next level was about the full year effectiveness and evaluation research that we did, not only in the full year pilots that Jane showed you, but in other circumstances since then in subsequent locations. So we thought about all 3 levels of research, and as she mentioned, we revised and refined the work based on integrating those findings throughout. So as we think about the work going forward, there are probably 4 major ideas around research, in addition to continually refining our program and thinking about it from this Agile Development ongoing refinement way. The first would be about fidelity of implementation, and how do we think about that? The adjustments or accommodation for different education contexts, for different levels of teacher experience, for different pedagogical and district level strategic choices, and the different environments in which our work will find itself, because obviously as a provider to school districts, we don't run the districts, but become a service provider to them. The second is tied to instructional shifts by teachers and thinking about them and the continuum that we call adopt, adapt, and innovate. But how do we think about I'll call it teacher effectiveness measures and teacher shift, and how can we understand and acknowledge the continuum and yet have milestones and some sort of outcome measures of the teacher's progress on that continuum. The third would be tied to some of the big trends that are happening along with blended learning in the US and I think worldwide, are about 21st century skills, social and emotional learning, which is sometimes called non-cognitive, and college and career readiness, all buzzwords that are trying to get at an aspect of the work that's more than just understanding the skill and knowledge. And you can see some of the pre and post data was really about the standards and skills and knowledge, but thinking about that much more broadly, tied to the 21st century skills, social emotional learning, and college and career readiness. And especially given our emphasis on working professionals, giving students exposure to careers and possible professions and the path to get there. And then the fourth would be around transference. As Jane described, we really have focused on several courses only. And how do we think about that work and the behaviors of students, the students thinking of themselves now with more ownership and agency in their work? And how do we see that manifesting itself into the rest of their school day within the class, the other classes they attend? So those are 4 areas we're exploring. So let me open it up to all of you for your experience in those areas, suggestions to us, interest in perhaps partnering in some way about thinking about how we would go about doing that research and evaluation. We see Randy and Lorianne are typing, but again, Justin, we can't see what they're typing, so thanks for sharing that information with us.
Yeah, of course. Looks like Lorianne has a comment here. She says that she thinks instructional shifts have been the biggest challenges in their own blended learning classes. So I guess getting at that idea of studying instructional shifts and the effectiveness of the professional development. I may be extrapolating a little bit on that point, Lorianne, but if you want to maybe refine that a little bit and correct me if I'm wrong there. And Randy,
We see lots of action, but
We're practicing that wait time that as teachers we were supposed to be so good at.
sure. Are you guys not able to hear me? I was speaking. I guess maybe you weren't able to hear me there. We did have a comment here from Lorianne, who is discussing whether or not, or she mentions that instructional shifts have been the biggest challenge in their own blended learning classes. So I take that to mean a challenge in terms of professional development. I don't know if I'm misinterpreting that, but Lorianne, you can keep typing there. And then Randy also mentions that they are not actively researching, more compiling and sharing research in their own organization. So it sounds like they're doing more to actually just kind of spread the word about the research that's taking place around this work. And Lorianne, did
I see there's lots of typing, but as I mentioned, we can't see the chat. So please share, Justin. But in the meantime, one of the things that we were so excited about as we watched this work is the level of student engagement leading to motivation, leading to a willingness and active learning stance by students to take on, and then the deep learning that comes from that as evidenced through higher grades, higher test scores on high stakes and benchmark tests, higher attendance in school, and as Jane described, lower tardiness, out of school suspensions, discipline, etc. So we were excited to see that they wanted to come to school and that they changed their self-image and their aspirations. And so that's another area we want to be able to assess is how do we evaluate students' change in self-awareness, self-image, self-agency, and aspirations.
We have a comment from Kristen, who says that many teachers also think that they already blend when the technology is thought of as merely a tool and not a vehicle. And Lorianne's
At this point for us to respond to?
Hi, yeah, are you guys not able to hear me? Hi, Jane, are you able to hear me? If so, could you let me know? It sounds like the rest of our attendees can hear me, but our presenter, unfortunately, cannot.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, we got it now. It's our
Sorry,
fault.
there was a mute button. Go ahead. So sorry.
No, that's okay. That's totally okay. I'll reiterate some of the comments that have come through the chat box already. So it looks like that's totally okay. No problem. Lorianne mentions that a big challenge that she has seen in terms of blended learning has been the idea around professional development. So that's something that she's particularly interested in. And Kristen also has a comment here that says that many teachers also think that they already blend when the technology is thought of as merely a tool, not a vehicle. And Lorianne says that there's a difference between blended learning and technology-rich environments. So I guess maybe a focus on that concept of blended learning and kind of imparting a better knowledge of blended learning on the instructors that you work with, and that the staff in the buildings that you actually partner with is something that sounds like is an interest to our participants today.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We're working with one school right now in Philadelphia, and I think that this is really playing out I was just talking to the person that's our contact there about so, it's also pretty common when teachers are learning how to do new things that the questions they're asking are, am I doing it right? Is this the right thing to do? Am I following the plan? And so I think that that's happening in some cases around the curriculum. Like, is this the right way to teach this thing? And then they shift into more, I guess I'd call it advanced changes, and that's in the blend, allowing the groups of kids to drive their own learning because everything they need is right there, and shifting the teacher's role from the instructor to not even facilitator, but more like a coach in working with the kids around the questions they have as they work through the process. So it's, yeah, it's definitely a process. Those are really good questions.
And when we think
Could you-
about blended, I was just going to say, when we think about technology and blended, we think about technology as you said, I think maybe it was Lorianne said, thinking about technology as a tool. And as you saw in those 4 circles, technology means so many things, but it shouldn't be the goal. So it's using the disciplinary tools like the centrifuge a genetics expert at the Mayo Clinic would use, or the software a Hollywood screenwriter would use. Also thinking about technology as a way for students to interact with working professionals from their desktop asynchronously, which was never possible. But recognizing that the blend is bringing the best of that as well as peer-to-peer conversations or reading a book or all the other things that have been also proven to be successful that we don't think of so much as technology, even though, you know, the Gutenbergs did. And so the blend is about using the right approach and the right tool at the right time, and technology-rich classrooms and high bandwidth and network schools make that possible. And at the same time, recognizing the adaptations required for schools that aren't one-to-one or other things give us the chance to say, hey, sometimes we do have students working together in person as opposed to independently, or reading aloud instead of listening to an audio file of a text. And other times we have the capability of saying, as we do in our biology course, every text is written at 3 different grade levels and 3 different reading levels, so students at different reading capabilities can discuss the same text together.
Great, thank you. Yeah, well, we're coming up close on our time here. I did have one other question that maybe you guys wouldn't mind addressing. Could you talk a little bit about some of the research that does inform your professional development? Any sort of research you might lean on, some emerging research that you're seeing on how to actually achieve that buy-in when it comes to the partnering staff that you're working with, and how to actually use some of that research in the professional development itself?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So, so we relied pretty heavily on the Learning Forward 7 standards of professional learning, which each one of those standards has a really deep research base. So I can't recall necessarily the citations there, but if you go to the Learning Forward website, so if you don't know Learning Forward, there's a national math organization, NCTM, and then there's the English teachers. Well, this is the organization that broadly and deeply about professional learning for educators. So learningforward.org. And so there are 7 standards, which include thinking about leadership, thinking about professional community, thinking about data, thinking about the learning designs of the research of the professional learning. Anyway, there are 7. And so thinking about those 7, each one with the body of research behind it, and then structuring the system so that each one of those things are accounted for. And so, so that's one place that I went to at the time. The other thing is that I really appreciate Deborah Ball's research that came mostly from mathematics, but her work is really about the intersection of the content that teachers teach, the students that are being served in that classroom, and the teacher. And so it's that triangle that needs to be addressed simultaneously. So it's, you can work on, for example, teachers learning how to use thinking maps or something like that. but those thinking maps need to be applied to that teacher's content area, and who the students are matters. And so that's a researcher I really relied on over time, because that's the work we do. It's the intersection between content, students, and pedagogy, what the teachers actually do, and the interchange between the three of them that really describes our work. So Deborah Ball. And the third would be Linda Darling Hammond. I'm sure you all know her work. She's just done a ton of research on professional development and what needs to be in place. The Gates Foundation recently, this is a new thing, has just very recently, I don't even think it's public yet, has done a survey of teachers about what works for them in professional learning. Interestingly enough, what they found is that teachers are as frustrated with the community, what are called professional learning communities. They're as frustrated with that as they are with the kind of professional development where teachers sit in a group and are just, talked to for hours on end. And so what it comes down to is what actually happens in those communities of practice, or those professional learning communities. And too often they're called professional learning communities, but they're actually meetings. And so who gets to drive the learning in those small collaborations is really, really important. So when we do our online meetings, for example, the first thing we do is check in with the teachers and find out what they want to talk about, which means we have an agenda, but sometimes we completely blow it out of the water because it's not what they need to talk about in the moment. So I think the Gates Foundation survey that was recently done is going to be very interesting about what teachers say about their own learning. So I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I've made sure to share the link to some of that research there in the chat box as well. Okay, well, again, we are running up on our time. I want to thank our presenters so very much for joining us today. I also want to thank all of our attendees. I did want to post a quick poll in our in our meeting room here. Actually, two quick polls. So if you could please answer the two questions that are there on how satisfied you were with today's webinar and how valuable you believe today's webinar were. And we would greatly appreciate your participation in that poll. And I'll go ahead and move the polls over here so we can touch on just a few more things before we wrap up. We wanted to make mention of our online and blended learning research community meeting, which will be held November 8th, 2015 as a pre-conference workshop to the INACOL Blended and Online Learning Symposium. So if you have an interest in helping us shape how that meeting is going to go, please reach out to us. Contact us at mvlri@mivu.org. And if you're interested in some of our ongoing initiatives, we encourage you to check out our podcast, which is linked there on this slide. So check out our podcast and hear some of the stories of the folks that we've been able to interview thus far in their work and how they use research in their work in online and blended learning. And if you're interested in writing for us, be sure to check out our initiative of our guest blogger program, where we actually host folks to come and present some of their work and their writing on our guest blog. And then we did want to direct you to our upcoming webinar, which will be next Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be hearing from Christine Pytash and Ian O'Byrne on their research on literacy instruction and learning in virtual, blended, and hybrid environments. In the meantime, if you need to contact us, please feel free to reach out to us, mvlri@mivu.org. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and you can see our LinkedIn, YouTube, and webinars pages there, where you can find recordings of our past webinars at our YouTube channel and our upcoming scheduled webinars on our webinar page of our homepage at our website. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your Wednesday. Take care.